that I presented. And I want to encourage you to take a look at the handouts. So there are two handouts for this session. The first is the summary of the slides. So it's a PDF with 2 slides per page. So you'll receive all of the content that I'm going to present today. And then the second handout is a document called Scenario Planning Resources. And it's a Word document that has hyperlinks to everything that you'll see mentioned on the slides. So do take advantage of that document, pop it open, and click on those links to find the resources that I mention throughout the program today. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. This is just a reminder that this presentation was created by the National Association of Community Action Agencies. And you'll see the rest of that text on this slide. All right, this next slide has my contact information. So I always encourage attendees at any of my workshops to reach out to me, to have a one-on-one conversation. If you have a question about anything I've talked about, if something I presented wasn't very clear, if you want to follow up, if you want to brainstorm, if you want to talk about a specific scenario planning technique, or if you want to talk about any risk issue in general, don't hesitate to give me a call at 703-777-3504 or send me an email to melanie@nonprofitrisk.org. Please know that those conversations are free of charge and are also confidential. So you're welcome to share with me something that's happening at your agency that you need some help with. And please know that I'll keep that conversation between the two of us. So don't hesitate to reach out. Or if you didn't receive the copies of the 2 handouts, or you had questions about anything that I talk about today, please follow up. So in terms of what I'm going to cover today, I've divided the content into 4 sections. We're going to start by looking at a few definitions of scenario planning. And as you'll see, I haven't just chosen one, I've chosen several to show you. There are many different ways to define scenario planning, and I want to explore a few. And then I want to jump in and think about why scenario planning is relevant to community action agencies and why it's especially relevant right now. And then the bulk of our time this afternoon will be spent on what I'm calling scenario planning basics and insights. So I've done a ton of research in preparation for this webinar, and I want to share with you what I've found and share not only the how-to in these different ways to do scenario planning, but also some takeaways, some insights. What did I learn? What are my thoughts about each respective process? And then, as I always do, I want to end the webinar with some closing thoughts and takeaways. And these closing thoughts and takeaways are inspired by some of the things that I've been reading. I'm somebody who likes to read as often as I possibly can. And when I read, I take notes, I type up my notes, and then I reflect back on my notes and I try to identify what was the one or two, or what were the 1 or 2 things that really struck me as I read that particular book. So I picked a few to share with you that I think are really relevant to the topic of scenario planning. All right, let's jump into a few definitions. I'm sure you came today with some ideas about what scenario planning means or what it is. And let's see if your thoughts and perspectives on this topic kind of sync up with what I've discovered. So the first definition is from the Georgia Center for Nonprofits. So this is one of the many statewide associations of nonprofits. And this one, of course, is headquartered in Atlanta. And at the Georgia Center for Nonprofits, the authors of their resource on scenario planning say that it's a planning method that helps us develop flexible plans based on external or internal forces. And it leads us to generate these critical what if statements or situations. So I like this definition. I like the idea that when you're scenario planning, you should be developing flexible plans. I think that that's such an important tenet of good scenario planning, flexible plans. And I like the idea that your plans are based on both external forces and internal forces. So I think this is a great definition. This next definition is from the consultancy Gartner, and they talk about scenario planning as a way to frame conversations about hypothetical future business scenarios. I like that kind of approach to the definition. I like this idea of framing conversations. I think too often when we think of a certain discipline in management, whether it's strategic planning or scenario planning, we imagine that it's a very clear roadmap on how to do something. When the truth is, I think so much of scenario planning is about having really candid, interesting conversations about the future. And the folks at Gartner also say that this is about identifying future uncertainties, things that may not be happening now, but could happen, and developing suitable action plans. I really like that language, suitable action plans. One of the things I found from working as a risk management consultant is that many teams, both in community action agencies and elsewhere in the nonprofit sector, many teams find themselves getting bogged down. They've created a plan that is too ambitious or too impractical or requires too much money or too much time, too much effort, instead of coming up with a plan that's reasonable, that's really practical, that's doable. So here at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, we're constantly trying to guide our members and our clients and the teams that we support to focus on practical. Start with practical. And when you have a plan in place that you think will work, I want you to ask questions about, is it practical? Is this doable? Do we have the people and the resources to do it? And if not, how can we trim it back to make it practical? So I think the Gartner definition is quite helpful, but I like both. So why is scenario planning relevant to community action agencies, and why is it relevant right now? Well, I wanted to share a couple of reflections on this issue, this topic of relevance. The first is that I think the global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has been an incredible wake-up call for not only nonprofit organizations, but all types of organizations in this country and around the world. It's been a global wake-up call that we are not necessarily in control of our destiny. So no matter how thoughtful your strategic plan was, no matter how competent your team was and is today, we are not completely in control of our destiny. And so we need tools, we need resources, we need approaches that will help us navigate in this world of incredible uncertainty. Some of that uncertainty is of our own making, but much of it is due to external forces and events far beyond our control. So for me, the pandemic was just an amazing wake-up call that we're not in charge of our destiny necessarily, and there are an incredible number of global forces impacting our work, impacting the resources we have available, impacting our success, right? Impacting the likelihood we'll be able to achieve our top goals and strategies. And in some cases, we have to be reactive, right? We have to anticipate the future, but we also have to react to what's happening around us. So the consultancy PwC, formerly known as PricewaterhouseCoopers, but now just known as PwC, has published a terrific resource titled Ready and Resilient, Using Scenarios to Prepare for What's Ahead. It's one of the resources that I've linked to in that second handout, so I encourage you to check it out. We're going to take a closer look at it in this webinar. But what they say in this piece titled Ready and Resilient, that none of us has ever seen such a complicated and intertwined set of factors driving a public health emergency of this magnitude. So these are unprecedented times. And they reference the resulting economic crisis, which, as all of us know, is not over yet. And each day, each week, each month, we're seeing new variations or new variants on that economic crisis. And we're facing such incredible uncertainty about what's next, what will happen next, how will those economic forces impact our agencies. And they close this section of the narrative in Ready and Resilient by saying, we're in a unique landscape here, way off the map. Well, one of the reasons that I like this statement about the relevancy of scenario planning is that, to some extent, a good scenario planning exercise should take you off the map, right? Whereas strategic planning and more traditional planning activities lead you to focus on what's right in front of you, what's within reach. Scenario planning should take you kind of off the map into kind of some uncharted territory and some unknown territory. So I think that's what a good scenario planning exercise does. As we think about the relevancy to community action agencies at this very moment, this kind of unique moment in time, I was reflecting on the work of a management consultant by the name of Randy Park. He wrote a book called The Prediction Trap, which is a book that I turn to frequently when I'm thinking about the future and I'm thinking about uncertainty and I am thinking about how to guide an organization that's trying to forecast, that's trying to almost predict the future. What he says in the book is that we should stop trying to predict the future and instead try to anticipate different possibilities, right? Anticipate different possibilities. And he says that the result of thinking about these different possibilities, not forecasting the future, but thinking about different possibilities, or to use his term, alternate futures, he says the benefit is that it will actually help us sleep better. Rather than expand the things we're worrying about or increase our worries or sleeplessness, thinking about the future will actually help us sleep better and enable us to develop plans so that we can cope no matter what happens. And he calls this kind of the anticipation approach. And he says that when we use more of an anticipation approach rather than a forecasting approach, he says we're more likely to seek out evidence that is contradictory to our current view of the world. And as a result, we're less likely to be blindsided. He says if we're trying to predict a single future, we're trying to imagine the future and we only have one vision in mind, there's a very good chance we're going to be way off course. We're going to wind up somewhere else and be terribly surprised. So this is an older book. It dates back, I think, at least 15 years or so, but it's still one that I turn to from time to time because it offers such an interesting view of the dangers of trying to predict the future and the benefits of thinking about alternate futures or alternative futures. All right, so we're going to talk about 4 different ways to approach scenario planning. And as we go through each approach, I want to kind of share the basics, share some visuals that will give you some idea about how each consultancy or how each organization suggests we go about scenario planning. And then I also want to reflect on some insights, some takeaways. So we're going to do that. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to post a question in the Q&A box, and I will monitor that Q&A box and try to answer as many as I can. If you want to ask that question one-on-one, reach out to me separately. So we're going to start with Bridgespan, which is a well-known consultancy. They talk about best, moderate, and worst case scenarios, and they also talk about key drivers. I think that's a very powerful concept in scenario planning. Then we're going to look at the Georgia Center for Nonprofits approach. Theirs focuses on trends, indicators, impacts, and options. I love that. I love the fact that with any planning activity, you should always have options, right? There's never one way to do anything. And then PwC invites us to think about drivers and then options, and then create baseline scenarios and then key questions. One of the things I love about the PwC framework is that it includes this category of key questions. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think that any exercise like this should be grounded in a commitment to have a candid, open conversation, right? To have that kind of generative discussion where we don't know how it's going to turn out, but we're willing to put our fears and concerns and thoughts and best ideas on the table. So it's all about having a good conversation. It's not about following some sort of regimented roadmap. And then Gartner, another consultancy, says we should identify a focus issue. We should identify 2 critical external uncertainties, and you'll see the visual of how they suggest we do this. We should identify the extremes, and then strategic options for 4 scenarios, and then drivers. So you're seeing some common elements in these approaches, but these are very different approaches to scenario planning. And There isn't one that is right. There isn't one that's going to be best for a particular community action agency. You have to figure this out. You have to figure out which one you like. And you may want to borrow from more than one technique. So certainly feel free to do that and create your own scenario planning approach. If you do that, if you adapt any of these techniques for your agency, I hope you'll let me know. I'd love to see what you come up with. But this is a great place to start, especially if you haven't done scenario planning before. So let's start with the bridge span approach. And again, it focuses on drivers and scenarios. So they suggest you begin with drivers of economics and impact, right? Drivers of economics and impact in your agency. And they suggest areas such as programs, operations, and funding. And then they invite you to develop best, moderate, and worst case scenarios, right? And think about those external factors that impact your agency, the impact of the external factors on key drivers. And then they ask you to identify a portfolio of actions. And I love this concept of a portfolio of actions because in any scenario, there's never just one pathway you can take. There will always be multiple pathways, multiple options. And so this concept of a portfolio is really nice, kind of fits my philosophy. And then they also ask you to identify trigger points. And we're going to see what that looks like in just a second. So at the bottom of the slide, I've included the fillable worksheets for the bridge span approach. It's all available free of charge. And you'll see the worksheets as well at the very top of my document titled Scenario Planning Resources, that Word document that Mary Beth is going to share with you. All right, here we go. So you'll see on the left-hand side, we're at step number 1, where we're invited to identify key drivers at risk. And again, they suggest programmatic drivers, operational drivers, and funding drivers, right? And so in this particular worksheet, the person who's completed it has listed 4 drivers of programmatic impact, 4 drivers of operational impact, and then 3 drivers related to organization revenue. And then over on the right-hand side of this resource, you'll see level of importance and level of risk. And this is just a quick kind of gut check on how significant is this and how costly, how impactful might this be. So that's on the left-hand side. And then on step 2, which is on the right-hand side, is where we start to develop and model scenarios. So we begin by identifying some external factors that impact our organization. In this particular example, the first factor is the pace of economic recovery. And then the second factor is school closures mandated by government. And these scenarios do relate to some extent, a global pandemic. And you'll see in the columns on the right-hand side, a best case scenario, a moderate case scenario, and a worst case scenario. I think these columns and these labels and this kind of frame for scenario planning is an easy one to follow. And I think if you were to gather a team of people to try this out, you'll find that people can pretty quickly come up with a best case scenario versus a worst case scenario related to those external factors. And then on the bottom half of step 2, we're looking at key drivers at risk from step 1. And again, we've got programs, operations, and funding. And again, we're seeing the best case, moderate case, and worst case scenario. So the set of worksheets that go along with this material for bridge span is pretty self-explanatory, and there's some directions throughout. But it will take you a few minutes to really digest it, to really understand it, and then to actually practice using it in your organization. So on this next slide, I've shown screenshots of step 3 and step 4. So step 3 is creating a portfolio of actions. And again, I love this concept because it's reminding us that there's never only one thing we can do. Right? Only one thing we can do. So on the left-hand side, they've listed these categories from appropriate for any scenario to more flexible. And the third category is larger and more permanent. And they've provided a definition of each topic And then they've invited us to list actions and even to plug in an estimated cost or savings, perhaps, right? So plus or minus. All right, so step 4 is determine key trigger points. And they explain that some of the potential actions outlined for the scenarios in step 3 will only make sense under certain circumstances. Therefore, it's helpful to identify trigger points, right? So you list the actions, reminder about which scenario that action is appropriate for. And then on the right-hand side in this fillable PDF, you would indicate the key trigger point. So again, this is taking scenario planning pretty far. There are these multiple steps. This requires a lot of work. This is not something you could do by yourself in a few minutes. And it's probably best done with a team of people. And it may be that if you're going to use this bridge span approach, you'll need to carve out multiple sessions where you'll get together to work through these steps. Maybe you work through one step and then kind of put it aside and come back to it another day. So it's not something you're going to do quickly, but I think the end result will be very affirming and help you identify some gaps and help you identify some kind of remote possibilities that you could plan for, right? These alternate futures that are worth pondering to make your organization as resilient as possible. So the second approach to scenario planning that I want to talk about this afternoon is from the Georgia Center for Nonprofits. And in this approach, the Georgia Center suggests that we start by doing an environmental scan. So that's something that each of us is familiar with. If you've ever done a strategic planning exercise, you know what an environmental scan looks like. And it really begins with identifying trends. What are the trends that are impacting your clients, your services, and even your funding sources? And then the second step is to think about knowable unknowns. And I love this terminology, knowable unknowns. Essentially, that's answering the question, what is it that we don't know that we could find out, right? That's knowable, something out there that would be helpful to know or that we need to know, but we don't have access to it right now, right? Often this is related to data. So we don't know how many clients are preferring this type of service over that type of service. We don't know exactly what the trends have been with respect to serving people or demand for services, but we could find that out, right? We could look through our files, we could look at attendance records and so forth and figure that out. So those knowable unknowns, what are the things related to those trends that we don't know and that we can find? And then the next step is to draft 5 key indicators and thresholds that would necessitate a response, right? If this were to happen, we would have to act, right? If our vacancy rate in key positions goes from 10% to 20%, we would have to do something. We might have to contract out certain services. If take-up of a certain service that we offer drops by 50% or more, we might have to eliminate that service or shutter that service, right? So 5 key indicators and thresholds. And again, they're encouraging us to think about trends that impact your organization in the area of client services and funding. They also ask us to define the potential impact of those indicators materializing, to think about options to adapt. And I love that word adapt because each of our agencies need to be thinking about adaptation all the time. It's not as black and white as stop start in most instances. It's about changing how we do things, responding to things. And even as the pandemic persisted in the last couple of years, so many agencies changed their approach to working from home, flexible work, rules related to the environment where you deliver services. So very few of you adopted rules in early 2020 that are still in place today. And that's okay because you were adapting to new information. You were learning as you go, right? You were making adjustments due to changing circumstances. And that's really the best way to lead. And you should be proud of those adaptations. Granted, there may be a few stakeholders who were frustrated that it appeared you kept changing your mind about things. Are we open? Are we closed? Are we partially open? What are the rules about being open? You have to withstand a bit of that criticism, knowing that you were adapting to new information and you were doing the best you could with the information you had available. And then the next step in the Georgia Center for Nonprofits framework is to identify the most viable response from the options. So what seems most promising? And then they close with creating an action plan. And they encourage us to think about outcomes we're trying to achieve, objectives, tasks, timelines, and resources. So they've created this graphic, which kind of breaks this process into these 5 steps. So starting with scanning, and then indicators, brainstorming, scenarios, and action. So it's kind of a simple framework. I think it's a memorable one, and it was specifically developed for nonprofit organizations. And I think it has a lot of promise. So I would encourage you to think about the Georgia Center for Nonprofits approach as you figure out which scenario planning exercise makes the most sense for your agency. All right, the next approach is from PwC, another consultancy, and they've suggested we start with drivers. And you're seeing that word appear in multiple frameworks, in these scenario planning frameworks, drivers, things that will impact your operating environment. So they've kind of narrowed it down from not just external factors and trends, but things that will specifically affect operations in your agency. They also want us to think about best case, moderate, and worst case options. And then they invite us to identify baseline scenarios. And then the closing is to identify those relevant follow-up questions you need to ask and answer. And again, I love this. I love that question prompts are part of this framework, because I really believe that the best risk management, the best crisis management, and certainly the best scenario planning exercises involve a lot of question prompts and discussion around those question prompts. So it's such an important tool. You should be using it all the time, even when you're presenting to your board, when you're presenting to an oversight team. Don't just present information, include question prompts in your presentation so that you draw the audience in and you get the benefit of the audience's wisdom and insights on the topic. I always include question prompts in my presentations to board committees and to boards. So you'll see the link to the PwC materials on scenario planning, and these were related to COVID-19. They were part of a suite of resources this firm developed related to the pandemic. Again, available free of charge on this website and linked in that Word document that I've shared. All right, let's take a closer look at this framework from PwC. Now, just so you know, this was developed early on in the pandemic, so early in 2020, but I think it's still a really interesting approach. And they've shared this example of scenario drivers that they imagined would affect the operating environment of their clients in 2021 and beyond, right? So you'll see on the left-hand side of the slide are the list of scenario drivers. And I think this is so interesting, this idea of these drivers. For COVID-19, they identified testing and social distancing, supply chain resiliency, government response, willingness of consumers to return to normal, arrival of a vaccine, and the shape of economic recovery. So they were thinking kind of far and wide about these potential drivers that might impact the operating environment of businesses in general in 2021. And then they used red, yellow, and green to signify these kind of worst case scenario, moderate case scenario, and best case scenario. On the right-hand side, they've taken a moderate worst case scenario, and you're going to see as I draw some arrows here and I add some questions, the kinds of things we want to be thinking about, those possible questions or decisions inspired by these scenarios. So the first bullet point has to do with testing and social distancing are successful, but many jurisdictions are less careful and testing shortfalls are not uncommon. So again, this is one possible outcome. A discussion question might be, should we restrict staff travel based on jurisdictional responses, right? So each of these kind of scenarios inspires a topic of conversation or a decision that needs to be made or at least considered. And then the second bullet point is haphazard government responses throughout the crisis, which again, they were considering this back in early 2020. It's actually something that we saw actually lived through. And so my possible question related to this bullet point is, should we reopen as soon as possible, but be prepared to close quickly or remain closed, right? So each scenario leads to a topic of conversation. And then the next one has to do with supply chain. And so my question prompt is, should we stock up on things we might need a year from now if they're available at this moment? And then finally, the idea that consumers become attuned to sheltering in place. And even after a vaccine is released, they may continue to restrict their movements. So my question prompt is, should we retool our policies to permit staff to work from anywhere indefinitely, right? So you'll see how at any stage during a crisis or at any stage when you're imagining these drivers of your operating environment, as you start to piece together these scenarios, right, or connect the drivers to best case, worst case, or moderate case scenario, you can develop these great question prompts to get you thinking about what would we do? What should we do now? What might we do then? So this is a really interesting framework, and I think it could be very helpful to agencies that want to do scenario planning and really follow a step-by-step process that also has some great flexibility built in. And so in PwC's Guide to Scenario Planning for Functional Leaders, they just remind us about things that functional leaders should know about enterprise scenario planning. Is you've got to define the focal issue, right? What's the most important planning question? You need to identify critical uncertainties among all the external forces that could affect the focal issue. You want to identify the extremes. You want to develop strategic options, and you want to establish drivers. So you can learn more about this and really digest this content by taking a look at that Guide to Scenario Planning. So here's the PwC planning template, and you'll see that they're inviting us to write the extreme outcomes of each uncertainty on the two ends of the two axes. And then for each quadrant, they want us to analyze how the two extreme uncertainties outcomes will interact. And I'm going to show you a little bit more on the next slide. So for this example, you'll see we've got two scenarios, right? We've got, and two extremes. So at the top of the screen, you'll see that the scenario has to do with automation. And one extreme is that we'll have easily and readily available tech-inspired solutions. So automated resources, telemetrics, and so forth will be readily available. The other extreme of this scenario is no automation. We're going to have to rely on paper processes. And then the other external driver where we've plotted two extremes has to do with public support for your cause. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that one extreme is support is shrinking, and then the opposite side, support is growing, right? So as you think about these extremes, these two different drivers, technology and support for your cause, then you start to develop scenarios that reflect these various points on the two axes. All right, so that was PwC. Now we're going to talk about some insights on scenario planning, especially from a McKinsey report. It's called Overcoming Obstacles to Effective Scenario Planning. And it includes some effective do's and don'ts, right? Things, reminders, things we should be doing, things we need to be cautious about. One of the reminders that I thought was really helpful in the McKinsey report was this idea of using scenario planning frequently to build muscle memory, right? The idea that we're going to try this out, see how it works, maybe iterate a bit, adapt, and then try it again, but not wait until 5 years have passed or 10 years have passed and we've all forgotten how this exercise went. So I think that's an important insight, an important tip is to try this out, try one of these techniques that I've shared today, adapt it to suit your organization, but try to do it as frequently as possible, right? Maybe you'll try it in the next year. You'll do 4 quarterly scenario planning exercises, right? To really develop some muscle memory. Another tip from this resource is that we don't want to delegate scenario planning to junior teams unless you have a high degree of psychological safety in your agency. Psychological safety is something that my team has written quite a lot about. In fact, we did a special article on it in our Risk Management Essentials magazine in an issue that was all about workplace culture. And it's such an important aspect of effective risk management, crisis management, scenario planning, in that psychological safety exists where people at all levels of the organization feel comfortable speaking up without fear of being embarrassed, without fear of being punished, and without fear of being labeled, kind of the Debbie Downer in our agency, that it's okay to speak about fears and concerns. And so this point that the folks at McKinsey make is that scenario planning exercises generally involve very senior people in an agency. And you may want to involve members of a team that are at the mid-level or even at the front lines in your agency. But don't do that unless those team members know that it's okay for them to come up with these kind of extreme scenarios, that it's okay for them to think far beyond the confines of your strategic plan and imagine those things that would be very disruptive to your mission. If people aren't comfortable speaking up, if they're not comfortable raising concerns, then it's probably a bad idea to delegate a scenario planning exercise. And then the next insight from McKinsey is to be wary of biases. So I do want to talk about these biases that get in the way of effective scenario planning exercises. So the first one is the availability bias. The availability bias leads us to make decisions based on what we already know, right? Things that we already know about our agency or about our part of the nonprofit sector. The availability bias. We reach for things that are available instead of making an effort to go outside our current knowledge base, right? So be wary of that. In scenario planning, in most instances, you're going to have to go beyond and gather information that you don't currently have, those knowable unknowns, right? Information that you could get, but you just don't have it in front of you at this particular moment in time. Another bias is probability neglect. This one came to the forefront with respect to the pandemic. Low probability events are easily dismissed or assigned excessive weight. Start with a qualitative assessment. Could this be impactful to our mission, right? Rather than dismiss something that is so unlikely to happen because of the fact that it's unlikely. So I had an organization I was working with back in 2018, and they prepared a really nice business continuity plan. So they had this wonderful business continuity plan. And in the table of contents, they had a list of some of the events that might trigger the implementation of their plan. And I was amazed that in that table of contents, they listed a pandemic, some sort of global epidemic, right? A health epidemic. And I thought, wow, in 2018, this agency was imagining that an epidemic or a pandemic could be disruptive to their agency. And then I flipped through the pages of the business continuity plan to discover that was the last time that scenario was mentioned. And my hunch is that particular disruptive event at some point was discarded, and no more work was done, no thinking was done to how might we prepare for it, because it was considered so improbable. Back in 2018, if anyone in your agency had mentioned the possibility of a global pandemic, most of us, including me, would have said, well, that's pretty unlikely. So this bias is just reminding us that we don't want to dismiss events simply because they seem to be low probability. We ought to focus on those events that could be impactful to our mission. Another bias that gets in the way of scenario planning is stability bias, right? And this is a bias, it's so interesting. Randy Park, who I mentioned earlier, the author of The Prediction Trap, uses this interesting term he calls the trap of extrapolation. And he describes this term as this scenario where this idea that many of us imagine the past as a straight line. If we were to describe our personal histories, our careers, the way we might describe it is it's as if one thing led to another, and we were just kind of following this very clear path. He says that the reality is, or what happens when we do that, when we imagine the past as a straight line, we also imagine the future as a straight line. So we tend not to look way off to the sides to see all the possibilities, those alternate futures. And what he reminds us of is that the past is actually a very windy path, and that each of our personal paths and pasts, our organizational pasts, followed a very windy path. And so the future is probably going to look more like that. It will be windy as well. So we almost get locked into this idea that things will be stable because we have reimagined the past as being stable. And then another bias that gets in the way of great scenario planning is excessive optimism. And I'm guilty of being an incurable optimist. And I'm always thinking about the best possible outcome and how even in dark times, there are silver linings. And so I've definitely been accused and have admitted to being an optimist. But I want you to think about your culture. In so many organizational cultures, people who speak with optimism and who are optimistic about everything are individuals who rise through the ranks to those executive roles. And those folks that are more cautious or they speak with less confidence about the future are kind of relegated to this kind of status in an organization. They're the people that bring us down. They're the Debbie Downers in the agency. And so I want you to think about that bias towards excessive optimism can kind of color the success of your scenario planning, can lead people to not want to participate or to be more cautious as they think about the various scenarios, things that could happen, maybe very remote, but could happen and be disruptive to your mission. So always pay attention to those biases as you're undertaking a scenario planning exercise in your agency. All right, just a few closing thoughts as we wrap up the session today. The first closing thought is this idea that with all of the strategies you come up with through your scenario planning exercise, I want you to embrace this idea of a portfolio approach. If everything you choose to do, if every action you choose to take is expensive and costly and hard, there's a good chance you'll never get to all of it, right? But I like this idea of a portfolio. I want to have a list of things that are hard, a list of things that I can do with a moderate amount of effort, and I want to make sure that there are some things I can do that are quite easy. I like a portfolio. I'm much more likely to embrace the challenges and the really hard things I need to do if some of my workday, if some of my plans for the year are relatively easy and some are somewhere in the middle, right? So that portfolio approach is a great way to approach thinking about action in your agency, whether it's scenario planning, risk management, or crisis management. I also want you to look for ways to make your action plans as straightforward and flexible as possible. And the scenarios you come up with, the scenarios you envision, those drivers that are potentially impactful to your operations may not actually come to fruition. Something else may happen. But if your scenario planning exercise and if your planning activity creates some flexible approaches, they will be relevant no matter what happens. They will be useful to the actual scenario that unfolds in your agency. The third tip is to be wary of social biases that include groupthink and sunflower management. Most of us are familiar with groupthink, right? The tendency of a small group of people to kind of connect to an initial idea and and just kind of stick with that. And there's this reluctance for someone to say, what about the opposite? Or I completely disagree, right? When we're in a group of colleagues that we like and respect, there's often this development of groupthink. Sunflower management refers to the tendency for groups to align with the views of their leader, right? To align with the views of their leader. Why is that? Because we want the leader to respect us, to like us, to approve of us. We want to be seen as somebody who's in their court, right? Who's supportive of their leadership. So pay close attention to this idea of psychological safety. And I encourage you to check out that article on our website on psychological safety and ask yourself, do we have an environment? Have we created a culture where people are really comfortable speaking up and saying what they're worried about and speaking their truth so that the truth can come to light? Or is it a culture where people don't speak up because they don't want to get yelled at, they don't want to be discouraged, they don't want to be labeled a naysayer or somebody who's negative? And as you do that, as you really cultivate psychological safety, you're making dissent welcome. One technique that I heard recently from a DEI consultant is that when we're having a group meeting, someone should be appointed the alternative viewpoint person, or the AVP, right? That someone in your team is designated the AVP at every meeting. And that person's job is to say, have we thought about this? What about the opposite? Or I have an alternative viewpoint, right? It's kind of an interesting concept, interesting technique. Some of you may actually have tried that alternative viewpoint, designating somebody as the alternative viewpoint person on your team. And I'd love to hear how that has worked out for you. So reach out to me and let me know. But think about, how are we making it comfortable and okay to dissent, to disagree? And then the last thought here is to make it okay to think the unthinkable, right? Make it comfortable. That when we think about the unthinkable, we think about these external factors and these drivers and these disruptive events, we're actually taking steps to make our agency safer, more secure, and more resilient. That this is a good thing. This is not about bringing everybody down, right? Killing the mood in the room, on the team. This is all about making our organization more resilient, right? More resilient. Yeah, some people are naturally that alternative viewpoint person, right? I have a member of my team who is our resident AVP. And as a result, we really don't need to appoint anybody because she will always speak up and raise the alternative viewpoint. And I have to admit that there have been times when I found that frustrating, but I've realized the more I've come to understand this concept, that is really valuable, because when everybody agrees with me, that's not necessarily a good thing. That means that we may be stuck in either groupthink or sunflower management. All right, a few more takeaways. This first one is from an old book called The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. And he writes that this rigorously scientific method of predicting the future can be applied only in special cases when prompt action is not urgent, where the factors involved are mechanical, or in circumstances so restricted as to be trivial. Wonderful reminder, beautifully written, beautifully said, that trying to predict the future doesn't make a whole lot of sense for community action agencies and for nonprofits overall. This idea of alternate futures is so much more powerful. When you're trying to predict the future, you have to have so much information that there's very little room for uncertainty and variance. All right, this next quote is from Randy Park from that great book, The Prediction Trap. He says that when you predict the future, it's all about presenting one view of how things will unfold. Whereas if you anticipate and prepare for the future, you're looking at multiple views, right? Multiple scenarios, alternate futures, to use his term. And he said, we need to let go of the notion that we're trying to predict what is most likely to happen and view the process as creating stories about alternative futures. I think this is a really powerful concept. And I think to some extent, this kind of takes the pressure off the team that you might bring together to do scenario planning. I think when people come into the room, they may be thinking, wow, scenario planning, there's a lot of pressure. We have to come up with these credible scenarios about what might happen. If you follow Randy Park's line of thinking, that it's all about creating stories about what might happen, not what will happen. We're not forecasting. We're imagining what might happen, what could happen based on these drivers and these external forces, so that we can be more resilient and ready for anything. I think that's a much better place to start. And I think your team will feel much more encouraged. And then this last takeaway is from the Nobel laureate Herbert Simon, who says that a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. More information is not always a good thing if it leads to blinkered thinking and analysis paralysis. So I want to caution you, don't try to uncover every stone. Don't try to come up with dozens of different scenarios, hundreds of alternative futures. Really focus on a couple of drivers, a couple of external trends, and work through one of these frameworks for scenario planning to identify some practical, reasonable, affordable action steps that your team can take to build resilience and be better prepared for whatever happens, right? Don't let yourself get overwhelmed by data, overwhelmed by many different scenarios. Really try to narrow in on just a few. All of these approaches encourage you to identify just a handful of drivers, just a handful of external factors, and think about best case, worst case, moderate case. You'll find that if you work through these exercises, you won't be overwhelmed. You won't have that sense of overwhelm and feel kind of paralyzed by the amount of information you've uncovered. So this slide has some of the resources that I've listed in the handout. The Word document titled Scenario Planning Resources actually has 9 resources, everything I've mentioned in the presentation, as well as hyperlinks, so you can find them, and they're all available free of charge. So that's my last slide. I want to turn it back over to Mary Beth, who I believe she's been posting the handouts I've been mentioning, and others have posted links to some of the articles I've referenced. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Mary Beth, so you can share some information about the Virtual Risk Summit.
Well, thank you so much, Melanie. This has been an awesome session. Folks, I hope that you got a few tools to help you be prepared for the future, not predict the future, but think about those alternative futures. I know I certainly did. And if you cannot get enough of risk planning and this type of content, we have a great opportunity for you. The Nonprofit Risk Management Center is putting on its second day of its 3-day risk summit on July 20th. This day will be all about risk management fundamentals. And really good news for the Community Action Network is the Community Action Partnership has already paid your registration fees. So guys, all of you can go to this amazing event at no cost. So all you have to do is go in and register at risksummit.org. You'll identify that you are affiliated with a community action agency, and you'll get your registration information. Melanie, is there anything you want to add about the Risk Management Fundamentals Day? Any specific content?
Absolutely. So all of the sessions, there are 8 sessions in total. All of them are recorded and available for up to 30 days, but only if you're registered. So you have to be registered to access those recordings. And so make sure you register in the next couple of weeks. And 8 interesting sessions you can attend. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can attend as many as you like live, and then watch the others. The recordings. One of my favorite sessions that we have planned is actually the lunchtime session. We have kind of a culinary theme for the conference this year. And our lunchtime speaker is Christine Ha, who's a chef and restaurant owner who was the winner on the 3rd season of MasterChef, featuring Gordon Ramsay. So I'm going to talk to Christine all about her experiences as a contestant on that reality TV show, and about taking risk in life and taking risk in the kitchen. So if you like to cook, if you like to eat, if you like to eat out, and you like to take risk, or you're interested in taking risk, I know you're going to love that session with Christine Haas. She's a wonderful human being, and we're all going to learn so much from her.
That sounds yummy. That's a fun pun for everybody. Little the end of that. There we go. Well, thank you so much, Melanie. Guys, we hope to see you at the Risk Summit. And I also want to flag, we're going to have Melanie back in August to talk about Fearless HR. The details about that upcoming webinar are now on the partnership website, and you'll see registration details this Friday in our e-news. So with that, please take the session evaluation. If you have any questions, as Melanie said, please call, email. She'd love to hear from you. The partnership would love to hear from you. Reach out anytime. And so with that, I think we'll say good afternoon and thank you, everybody. Take care.